The wind had no memory and no mercy. It was the only thing out here, on the vast, sun-scorched plains of the territory, that Jesse Rollins felt a kinship with. It scoured the land clean, just as he wished something could scour the pictures from his mind. He rode with his hat pulled low, the brim casting a deep shadow over eyes that had seen too much gun smoke and betrayal for a man of 32 years. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, moved with a steady, ground-eating gait that had carried them across 1,000 miles of loneliness. They were a single, moving speck in a world of endless grass and sky. But for Jesse, the world was never empty. It was crowded with ghosts. The loudest one had his brother's face, Caleb, younger by 5 years, with a laugh that could charm a snake and a temper that could start a fire in a river. The memory always came the same way: the splintered wood of the rail car, the smell of sulfur and fear, the shouting, and Caleb's eyes, wide and wild, looking at Jesse not with hatred, but with a terrible, pleading surprise. Just before Jesse let him go, he'd lowered his pistol. He'd let his own brother, an outlaw, ride away from justice, and in that single moment of weakness, Jesse had lost everything: his badge, his name, and the small piece of his soul that still believed in black and white. He shook his head, a gesture as familiar as breathing, trying to dislodge the image. The past was a set of tracks you could not ride away from. It followed you, silent and patient, waiting for you to tire. He spurred Dust onward, toward the faint smudge on the horizon that was the outpost of Purgatory Flat. It was a name that fit: a handful of squat, clapboard buildings huddled together as if for warmth, though the only thing the land offered in abundance was heat and dust. It was a place for people on their way to somewhere else, or for those who had nowhere left to go. Jesse was just passing through, delivering a crate of medicines for the doctor in the next county. A simple job, no guns, no laws to break or uphold, just riding. He dismounted in front of the general store, the only 2-story building in the settlement, its false front peeling under the relentless sun. The boardwalk groaned under his boots. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, cured meat, and dust. A few men lingered by the counter, their talk low and lazy. The storekeeper, a balding man named Silas with a stained apron, nodded at Jesse. "Rollins, thought that was your horse. Got that crate in the back for you." "Appreciate it, Silas," Jesse said, his voice a low rumble. He pulled a small pouch of coins from his saddlebag. "Need some flour, coffee, and bacon for the trail." As Silas weighed out the goods, the other men's conversation drifted over. "Heard Harmon's boy saw her again last week." One of them, a lanky ranch hand, said, "Out by the burn. Said she was just standing there, looking at the creek. Didn't even move when he rode past." Another man spat a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "The ghost woman. Ought to run her off. Bad luck, a thing like that." Jesse kept his face neutral, his attention seemingly fixed on the tins of peaches Silas was stacking. But his ears were tuned to their words. "Ain't her fault her people got themselves killed," Silas muttered, not looking up from his work. He was a gossip, but he had a sliver of decency the others lacked. "Maybe not," the ranch hand countered. "But she ain't right. Cursed, I say. That fire took her family and half her face. Should have taken the rest of her with it. Would have been a kindness." The cruelty of the remark was as casual as the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams slanting through the grimy window. It landed in the quiet store like a stone dropped in a still pond. Jesse's jaw tightened. He'd seen this brand of callousness before. It was the kind that grew in hard places, where sympathy was a weakness and survival meant turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. People feared what they could not understand, and they hated what they feared. "Where does she live?" Jesse asked. The question was quiet, but it cut through the men's chatter. They turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Strangers didn't ask about the ghost woman. Silas hesitated, then wiped his hands on his apron. "Miles out. West of here. The old Miller place. Ain't nothing left of it but a shell. I hear she's on her own? Been that way for a year, maybe more, Silas confirmed. No one goes out there. No reason to. Jesse's eyes swept over the men, who now looked uncomfortable under his steady gaze. He saw the easy judgment in their faces, the dismissal of a human being as nothing more than a local horror story. He thought of Caleb, left to the wolves of the world because Jesse himself had failed him. He couldn't save his brother. He couldn't undo the past, but he could put a sack of flour on a ruined porch. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. Add another sack of flour to my bill, Silas, Jesse said, and some salted pork, and a jar of that salve you keep for burns. Silas raised an eyebrow, but did as he was told. The other men fell silent, watching Jesse as he paid for the goods and packed them into his saddlebags, his own supplies on one side, the extra bundle on the other. He didn't offer an explanation, and they didn't ask for one. As he shouldered the heavy crate of medicine, he gave the men one last look. It wasn't a threat, just a silent statement. Then he walked out, the jingle of his spurs the only sound in their wake. The trail to the old Miller place was barely a trail at all. It was a faint suggestion of a path, overgrown with sagebrush and prickly pear. The sky, a brilliant, cloudless blue when he'd left Purgatory Flat, was beginning to turn a sickly yellow-brown in the west. A dust storm was brewing. Jesse could smell it, a dry, electric scent on the wind. He urged dust into a faster trot, hoping to outrun the worst of it. The landscape grew more desolate, the earth cracked and dry. He rode past skeletal remains of cattle, their bones bleached white by the sun. This was hard country. It broke animals and it broke people. He thought of the woman, alone out here, with half a face and a ruined cabin. What kind of grit did a person need to survive that? He found the tracks about a mile from where Silas had said the cabin would be. 2 horses, shod. They were fresh, no more than a day old. They hadn't stayed on the path but had cut across the land, making a wide circle around the property line, as if scouting. It wasn't the mark of curious neighbors. It was the mark of men with a purpose, and likely not a good one. Jesse's hand rested instinctively on the butt of his Colt Peacemaker, the feeling that had settled in his gut back in the store. A cold knot of unease tightened. The wind picked up, whipping sand and grit into his face. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth as the sky darkened. The storm hit just as he crested a low rise and saw it. The cabin, or what was left of it. It was a black, skeletal ruin against the swirling brown dust. One half of the roof was gone entirely, leaving the charred rafters exposed like the ribs of a carcass. The stone chimney stood tall, but the log walls on one side were blackened and collapsed. It looked like a place of death, a monument to a tragedy. Yet there was a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a fragile thread of life in the midst of desolation. He dismounted, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't want to spook her. He slung the bag of supplies over his shoulder and approached the cabin on foot, the wind tearing at his coat. That's when he saw her. She was standing near a small, well-tended garden patch, a bucket in one hand. She was thin, her dress worn and faded. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was pulled back in a messy braid, but loose strands whipped across her face in the wind. She wore a glove on her left hand, but her right was bare, the skin puckered and scarred. As he got closer, she turned, and he saw her face. The right side was untouched, perfect, a delicate jawline, a high cheekbone, a clear blue eye the color of a winter sky. But the left side was a mask of ruined flesh. The fire had kissed her from her temple down to her chin, leaving a tapestry of mottled, discolored scars. Her left eye was clouded, the eyelid tight, pulling the corner of her mouth into a permanent, tragic grimace. She didn't look like a ghost. She looked like a woman who had been dragged through hell and had, by some miracle, crawled out the other side. her good eye fixed on him, wide and sharp with the wariness of a coyote. There was no welcome in it, only suspicion. Her body was rigid, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. "State your business," she said. Her voice was rough, cracked from disuse, but it held a core of surprising strength. "Ma'am," Jesse said, stopping a respectful distance away. He kept his hands in plain sight. "Name's Jesse Rollins. I was passing through Purgatory Flat and heard you were out here. Thought you might be in need of supplies." He held out the sack. Her gaze flickered to it, then back to his face. A flicker of something, shame, anger, crossed her features. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity," he said calmly. "Just a delivery. Winter's coming." "I'm aware." The wind howled around them, forcing them to raise their voices. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Jesse could see the tremor in her bare hand, but her chin was high. She was a fortress, and he was an invading army. "You should get inside," he said, gesturing toward the storm. "This is a bad one." "I've seen worse," she shot back. He saw it then, behind the fear and the defiance. She wasn't just surviving, she was hiding. The isolation wasn't just a circumstance, it was a shield. The world had hurt her, and she had decided to leave it behind entirely. "I'll just leave these on the porch. Then," he said, not wanting to push her. He took a step forward, and she took a reflexive step back, her hand flying to her side as if reaching for a weapon she didn't have. The movement was pure instinct. Jesse stopped. He knew that kind of fear. It was the kind that got etched into your bones. He set the sack down gently on the ground between them. "There's flour, pork, and some salve, in case you need it." She stared at the sack, then back at him, her one good eye searching his face for a trick, for the pity she so clearly despised. Why? It was the same question he'd been asking himself. "Because it's a long way from town," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "And no one should have to face a storm alone." He turned to leave, and as he did, her eyes, clouded with pain and memory, seemed to look right through him. The air had smelled of pine and her mother's baking bread. Ambrose was sitting with her on the porch swing, his arm warm and solid around her shoulders. He smelled of clean soap and ambition. He was going to be a lawyer, he'd told her, a man of standing, and she, Clara Miller, was going to be his wife. He'd given her a silver locket, cool against her skin, with his initial engraved on the front. "This land, Clara," he'd said, his voice smooth as polished wood, gesturing out at the 160 acres her father had tamed from the wilderness. "It's worth more than you know. There's talk of silver in these hills." She had trusted him. She had loved the way he looked at her, as if she were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She had loved the future he painted for them, full of white picket fences and children's laughter. The betrayal had been as swift and silent as a snake in the grass. The land dispute with the mining conglomerate had been bitter. Her father refused to sell. He'd built this place with his own 2 hands. Ambrose had promised to help, to use his knowledge of the law to protect them. Instead, he had used it to sell them. He made a deal, the land for a partnership, and to make the deed clear, to remove the stubborn homesteaders who stood in the way. He had brought them 3 men, their faces grinning and cruel in the torchlight. They were not lawyers. They were animals. She remembered Ambrose not looking at her as they dragged her father from the house. He just stared at the deed in his hand, the one her father had been forced to sign. The last thing she saw before they threw the first torch was his back, walking away, never once looking back at the life he was leaving to burn. The fire was alive, a hungry, roaring beast. It ate the wood. It ate the curtains. It ate the air. She remembered the heat, the searing pain as she scrambled through the smoke, her nightgown catching fire. Her little brother, Thomas, was still inside. His room. She could hear his cries, thin and terrified, over the roar of the flames. She had dragged him out. She remembered the impossible weight of his small body, the way the burning roof beam fell, trapping his legs. She remembered pulling, screaming, her hands blistering on his clothes, the fire licking up her arm, her hair, her face. She remembered the world going black. The last sound, not the fire, but the mocking laughter of the men as they rode away, leaving her family for dead in their burning home. Clara blinked, the memory receding like a foul tide, leaving her beached and shaking on the shore of the present. The man was walking away, his back to her, broad and straight. He didn't limp or stagger in the punishing wind. He moved through it, a solid, unshakable presence. He was nothing like Ambrose. There was no polish to him, only dust and a deep, quiet sorrow she recognized because she wore a similar shroud herself. He reached his horse, swung himself up into the saddle with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent on horseback. He did not look back. Jesse Rollins. He had a name. He'd brought her supplies. He hadn't recoiled from her face. He had met her gaze directly, his own eyes a startlingly clear gray, like a stormy sky just before the rain. He had seen her, all of her, and he hadn't turned away in disgust. He had simply left the food and walked away. It was the first act of simple, uncomplicated kindness she had received in over a year, and it terrified her more than any threat. The storm was a wall of brown now, swallowing the world. She watched as Jesse Rollins rode straight into it, his silhouette wavering, then disappearing completely into the swirling chaos. Clara stood there for a long moment, the wind tearing at her dress, the grit stinging her good eye. Then, slowly, she bent down. Her gloved hand trembled as she reached for the sack he had left. It was heavy, real. She clutched it to her chest, a strange, aching pressure building behind her ribs. For the first time since the fire, she was not entirely alone, and she did not know if that was a comfort or a curse. She turned and carried the supplies into the broken shell of her home, bolting the splintered door against the storm. 3 weeks passed. The dust storm had scoured the landscape, and a fragile autumn chill had begun to settle in the air at night. Jesse delivered his crate of medicines and turned his horse back around. He told himself it was just a check. He told himself it was because he was passing that way regardless. He knew he was lying. He had thought of her every day, a lone woman standing against the wind, with half a face and a spirit that refused to break completely. He found her not by the cabin, but a little ways off, near a freshly turned mound of earth. A small, rough-hewn cross, fashioned from 2 pieces of scrap wood, was stuck in the top. She was on her knees, her good hand resting on the soil. She didn't seem to notice his approach until dust snorted, and her head snapped up. The suspicion was still in her eye, but the sharp, defensive edge was gone, replaced by a deep and hollow sadness. "He was old," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't need to explain who he was. A scruffy, one-eared dog had been her only companion through the long, silent months. His heart just gave out this morning. Jesse dismounted. He looked at the small grave, then at her. Grief was a language he understood. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply took off his hat and stood beside her, a silent witness to her sorrow. They stood like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the sigh of the wind through the dry grass. Finally, she pushed herself to her feet, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her scarred hand. "You came back." It was not a question. "I did," he said, brought some coffee. He retrieved a small burlap sack from his horse. This time, when he held it out, she took it. Her fingers brushed against his for a fraction of a second, and he felt her flinch. A tiny, almost imperceptible recoil, as if from a hot coal. He pulled his hand back slowly, giving her space. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching the bag. She still wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "You didn't have to." "I know." That was the start of it. He began to come back every week. He never stayed long, and he never came empty-handed. A slab of bacon, a bag of beans, once a small tin of precious sugar. He learned her name was Clara. She learned his was Jesse. Words were traded like rare coins, one at a time, with long silences in between. He learned the shape of her pain not from what she said, but from what she did. One afternoon, he was hammering a loose board on her porch into place, and the sudden, sharp bang made her cry out, a raw, strangled sound from inside the cabin. He stopped immediately, the hammer held motionless in his hand. He heard her ragged breathing, the sound of a woman trying to convince her own heart that she was safe. He finished the job using slow, deliberate pressure, avoiding any sudden noises. He saw the evidence of her nightmares in the dark circles that sometimes appeared under her good eye. He would arrive to find her looking exhausted, her movements slow and heavy, as if she had spent the night fighting battles in her sleep. He never asked about them. He would just set about a task, making his presence a quiet, steady thing in her chaotic world. The biggest task was the roof. The gaping hole on the west side of the cabin was a constant invitation to the wind and the rain. One day, he arrived not with food, but with a bundle of fresh-cut timber and a box of nails he'd bought in the next town over. She came out onto the porch, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "What is that for?" "Your roof," he said, unloading the wood. "I didn't ask you to." "No," he agreed, not stopping his work. "You didn't—" She watched him for a while, a war of pride and desperation playing out on her face. Finally, she went back inside without another word. But a few hours later, as he was balanced precariously on the rafters, a mug of hot, weak coffee appeared on the porch railing below. He drank it, and it was the best coffee he had ever tasted. He worked for days on that roof, patching the hole, making it solid and tight against the coming winter. He learned to read her moods. A quiet day meant the ghosts were walking. A day she spent tending her small garden was a good day. He never touched her. He never overstepped the invisible line she had drawn around herself. And every single day, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, he would pack his tools, nod to her, and leave. The darkness was hers, and he would not trespass. On his trips back to civilization for supplies, Jesse started asking quiet questions. He learned that the Miller deed, Clara's deed, had been considered lost in the fire, the land all but abandoned. But a new territorial survey had recently uncovered the original claim, filed and paid in full by her father years ago. The land, which everyone had assumed was worthless, sat squarely on top of a newly discovered silver lode. The Blackwood Mining Company, a powerful outfit from back east, had already bought up all the surrounding claims. Clara's homestead was the final, stubborn piece of the puzzle. The memory of the fresh tracks he'd seen near her land turned sour in his gut. They were not random trespassers. They were scouts. His next stop was the sheriff's office in Purgatory Flat. Sheriff Brody was a heavy man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had long ago given up on seeing justice, settling instead for simple quiet. "There's a woman living out on the old Miller place," Jesse began, leaning against the doorframe. "I have reason to believe someone might be looking to force her off her land." Brody didn't even look up from the wanted poster he was studying. "The ghost woman. What's she to you? Rollins?" "She's a citizen on her own land." The sheriff finally looked up, his expression one of pure weariness. "That land is a worthless patch of dirt. Who'd want it?" "Blackwood Mining, for one," Jesse said. A flicker of understanding, or perhaps just annoyance, crossed Brody's face. He sighed, a heavy, rattling sound. "Look, Rollins, I've got enough trouble with drunks and cattle rustlers. I'm not riding miles out into the scrub to check on some half-crazed woman who ought to have the sense to move on. If Blackwood wants the land, they'll get it one way or another. That's how the world works." "It's your job to see the laws upheld," Jesse said, his voice dangerously low. Brody stood up, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "My job is to keep this town from burning down. What happens out in the dust is between a man and God. Besides, he added, a cruel dismissiveness in his tone, she won't last the winter anyway. The cold will solve the problem for everyone. Jesse walked out without another word, the sheriff's casual disregard echoing in his ears. The law was not coming. The town would not help. They were on their own. When he returned to the cabin, something was different. The door was propped open, and the air smelled of wood smoke and something else, charcoal. He found Clara sitting at her small, rough-hewn table, hunched over a piece of paper, in her good hand. She held a stick of charcoal, sketching with intense, focused movements. She had started to draw again. He stood quietly in the doorway, not wanting to break the spell. Her sketches were scattered on the table. They were not pictures of flowers or sunsets. They were raw, powerful images of her memory. One showed a house engulfed in flame, the lines jagged and angry. Another was of dark, shadowy figures, their faces indistinct but their menace palpable. And then he saw it, a sketch of a lone man on horseback, riding away, his back to the viewer, a silhouette against a swirling storm. It was him. She looked up, startled, and quickly tried to gather the papers, a flush rising on her unscarred cheek. "Don't stop on my account," Jesse said softly. "They're good." She shook her head, hiding the drawing of him beneath the others. "They're just scraps." He didn't ask about the fire. He didn't ask about the shadows. He knew instinctively that to ask would be to rip open a wound she was just learning how to stitch closed. Instead, he looked at her trembling right hand, the one she always favored, and changed the subject. "I was a lawman once," he said, his voice even. "A deputy marshal. I can teach you how to shoot." Her head came up, her good eye wide. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy and significant. It was not an offer of pity. It was an offer of power. "Why?" she asked. "Because this is hard country," he answered, his gaze steady. "And winter is coming." He didn't mention the mining company or the sheriff. He didn't need to. She knew, better than anyone, that the world was full of men who took what they wanted. She looked down at her gloved left hand, the fingers beneath it twisted and weak. Then she looked at her good hand, the artist's hand, now stained with charcoal. After a long silence, she gave a single, sharp nod. "All right." He brought out his Colt, the metal dark and heavy. He showed her how to hold it, how to check the chambers, how to aim. He stood behind her, close but not touching, his voice a low murmur by her ear. Her hand trembled as she took the revolver. It was a tool of violence, the same kind of violence that had destroyed her world, but it was also a tool of survival. He set up a few empty tins on a fence post 50 feet away. "Just squeeze easy," he coached. "Don't jerk it." She raised the pistol, her arm shaking with the unaccustomed weight. She closed her clouded eye, focusing with her good one. She took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the kick of the gun jarring her entire body. The shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to the left of the target. But she didn't drop the gun. She held on, her knuckles white. She set her jaw, took another breath, and fired again. And again. By the end of the lesson, she had managed to hit one of the tins, sending it spinning off the post with a satisfying clang. A small, grim smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a start. That night, a cold front moved in, and the wind carried the first real bite of winter. Jesse had stayed later than usual, securing a loose shutter that was banging in the wind. The sun had already set, leaving the sky a deep, star-filled indigo. He knew he should leave. He always left. He found her sitting by the fire, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring into the flames. The flickering light played across her face, casting the scars into deep relief, making them seem to move like living things. He stood in the doorway, ready to say his goodbyes. She spoke without turning around, her voice soft and thin against the sound of the wind. "Why are you really helping me?" The question was not an accusation. It was a genuine plea for understanding. She had asked it before, but this time was different. This time, she was truly asking. Jesse walked over and stood by the hearth, looking down at the fire. He thought of Caleb's face in the gun smoke. He thought of his own failure, the guilt that rode with him every day. He thought of all the times he had been too late, or had made the wrong choice. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers in the firelight. Because someone should have helped you sooner. The next time Jesse rode out, he was leading a pack mule. Strapped to its back, wrapped in canvas, was a small, pot-bellied stove, its iron black and solid. The one in her cabin was a rusted-out wreck, leaking smoke and offering little warmth against the coming cold. He'd traded a month's wages for it in a town 2 days' ride south. He also carried a sack of fresh mortar and a new trowel. The chimney needed chinking before the first snow. Clara watched him unload his cargo from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She said nothing as he set to work on the chimney, methodically chipping out the old, crumbling mortar and replacing it with fresh, solid lines. She didn't offer to help, but she didn't tell him to leave, either. An hour into his work, a cup of water appeared on a nearby stump. This became their new routine. His visits stretched from a few hours to entire days, filled not with conversation, but with shared labor. They moved around each other in a quiet, practiced rhythm. He worked on the cabin. She worked in her garden, preparing the soil for winter. The silence between them was no longer the tense, brittle thing it had been at first. It had softened, becoming a comfortable space they could both inhabit without the need for words. It was during one of these long, quiet afternoons, as he was fitting the new stovepipe, that she finally began to speak of the past. Her voice was low, the words picked carefully, as if she were examining each one for flaws before letting it go. He was going to be a lawyer, she said, her back to him as she weeded a row of withered beanstalks. Ambrose, he had soft hands, and a voice that could talk a bird right out of a tree. Jesse kept working, his movements steady. He didn't turn to look at her, sensing that her story needed the freedom of not being watched. He said he loved me, she laughed, a short, bitter sound. He loved this land more, or what was under it. He told me it was ours, our future. Then he sold that future for a partnership with the mining men. He brought them here himself. She paused, her hands still in the dirt. I remember he wouldn't look at me. As they dragged my father out, he just kept his eyes on the paper, on the deed, like it was the only thing in the world that was real. Jesse stopped his work. He looked at her small, hunched figure, and a cold, hard anger settled in his chest. It was an old, familiar feeling. It was the anger he felt for all the bullies and the cheats of the world, the ones who preyed on the decent and the trusting. He walked away, she finished, her voice a flat, dead thing. And then the fire started. She did not speak of it again for another week, but the wall had been breached. Fragments of her life before the fire began to emerge in small, hesitant offerings. She spoke of her mother's quilting bees, of her father's booming laugh, and she spoke of Thomas, her younger brother, who had been afraid of the dark and loved the story of David and Goliath. The day Jesse finished the chimney, a sense of finality and accomplishment hung in the air. The stove was installed, drawing perfectly, its warmth pushing back the encroaching chill. They sat at her small table, sharing a pot of coffee, the new warmth a tangible presence in the room. He noticed she kept rubbing the scars on her bare right hand. He had never asked about them. He had never asked about the fire at all. Everyone in town thinks it was the fire that did this, she said suddenly, looking at her scarred hand, then gesturing to the left side of her face. That I was just caught in it, a victim. Jesse waited. He knew there was more. It was, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But not how they think. She finally raised her head, and her good eye, clear and blue, and full of a pain so deep it seemed bottomless, met his. Thomas was still inside. He was only 8. I could hear him screaming for me. A roof beam had fallen. It pinned him. She took a ragged breath, and for the first time, Jessie saw tears welling in her eye. The fire was everywhere. I tried to lift it. I couldn't, so I pulled him. I pulled him out from under it. She held up her hands, the gloved one and the scarred one. My nightgown was on fire, my hair. I didn't feel it. I just kept pulling. I dragged his little body out onto the grass. He was already gone. She finally broke, a single, wrenching sob escaping her lips. These scars, they aren't from the fire that killed my family. They're from trying to save it. The confession settled in the small cabin, profound and devastating. Jessie looked at her, at the ruined side of her face, and he no longer saw disfigurement. He saw the fierce, terrible love of a sister. He saw a badge of courage worn by a soldier who had lost her war. The townsfolk called her the ghost woman, a cursed thing. They were fools. They were blind. They were looking at a hero and seeing only a monster. He felt an urge, sharp and powerful, to reach across the table, to offer some comfort, but he held back. The space between them was still fragile. Instead, he offered her the only thing he had of equal value, his own broken past. "I have a brother," he said, his voice quiet but rough with emotion. "His name is Caleb." Clara looked up, her tears momentarily halted by the gravity in his tone. "He was always wild," Jessie continued, his gaze drifting to the fire now crackling in the new stove. Quick with his fists and quicker with his temper, but he had a good heart in him. I thought he did. Anyway, I was a deputy marshal back in Kansas. I tried to look out for him, tried to keep him on the straight and narrow, but it was like trying to gentle a Mustang. He fell in with a bad crowd. Robberies, hold-ups. I warned him. I told him I'd have to bring him in if our paths ever crossed on the wrong side of the law. He paused, the memory coiling in his gut. They did. They tried to rob a train carrying a federal payroll. Me and the marshal were waiting for them. It went bad. Gunfire. A good man, a clerk, was killed. I cornered Caleb in one of the cars. He had his gun on me. I had mine on him. He begged me, told me he didn't kill the clerk, that it was the gang's leader. He swore he'd go straight if I just let him walk away. Jessie's hands clenched into fists on the table. I looked in his eyes, and I saw the kid I grew up with, the boy who used to follow me everywhere. So I lowered my pistol. I let him go. I turned my back on the law, on my badge, on the man who had been shot dead in the dirt. I chose my brother. He finally looked at Clara, his face a mask of old guilt. The marshal found out. I lost my badge. I lost my name. I had to leave town in disgrace. And Caleb, he never went straight. He fell in with a worse crowd. Last I heard, he was riding with a gang of hired guns, doing whatever dirty work paid the most. I let an outlaw go, and I lost everything for it. I see that clerk's face every time I close my eyes. I failed him, and I failed my brother, too. They sat in silence, their 2 broken stories laid bare on the table between them. Her scars were on the outside. His were on the inside, but they were wounds from the same war, the war of love and loss and family. As the days shortened and the first frosts silvered the prairie grass, the fragile trust between them deepened into a quiet intimacy. Winter began to close its grip on the high plains, isolating them completely. Jessie's visits became longer. Sometimes the threat of a storm meant he stayed for a day or 2, sleeping on a bedroll he kept by the hearth. Clara began to heal in small, almost imperceptible ways. One afternoon, she tried to cook a real meal on the new stove, a stew of salted pork and the last of her garden potatoes. It was lumpy and too salty, but they ate it together. As Jessie took a bite, he coughed, trying to hide a wince. A tiny smile touched Clara's lips. "Too much salt?" "Just right," he lied, reaching for the water bucket. She laughed. It was not the bitter, broken sound he had heard before. It was a soft, rusty sound, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. But it was a genuine laugh. The sound went through him, warming him more than the fire. Their companionship was a thing of gentle spaces and unspoken understanding. He would mend her tack, his large hands surprisingly nimble with the leather and thread. She would sit nearby, sketching, her charcoal stick flying across the page. She drew the prairie, the skeletal remains of a cottonwood tree, his horse, dust, standing patiently by the fence. She never drew people's faces, only their outlines, their shadows. One evening, the wind howled outside, a mournful, lonely sound. Jesse was cleaning his revolver by the firelight when he noticed Clara sitting on the floor, her back to him. Her shoulders were shaking. He put the gun down and walked over to her. She was holding something in her hands, a small, blackened lump of silver. It was a locket, melted and twisted by the fire. Its surface bubbled and warped beyond recognition. She was crying, not with loud, wrenching sobs, but with a silent, desperate grief that seemed to shake her to her very core. Jesse knelt beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. The locket was a symbol of everything she had lost. Her family, her future, her face, her trust in love itself. It was the wreckage of a life that was never lived. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and covered her trembling hands with his own. His touch was firm, gentle. She flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. Then, miraculously, she stilled. She did not pull away. She let him hold her hands, her tears falling onto the ruined silver and his calloused skin. They didn't kiss. They did not speak of love. They just sat there together in the warm, firelit cabin. The storm raging outside. Two lonely souls sharing the weight of their past. The silence was heavy, but it was a shared weight now. After a long time, her crying subsided into shuddering breaths. Jesse leaned closer, his voice a low whisper, meant only for her. "You're not broken," he said, "just surviving." She squeezed his hand, a faint pressure that was both an acknowledgement and a thank you. It was the first time she had willingly touched him. Far away, in the muddy, rutted streets of Purgatory Flat, a man dismounted in front of the saloon. He was younger than Jesse, with the same gray eyes, but where Jesse's held a quiet sorrow, this man's eyes were hard and restless. He carried himself with a gunslinger's swagger, his hand never far from the pistol on his hip. He was leading a group of 4 other rough-looking men. They were the new enforcers for the Blackwood Mining Company. His name was Caleb Rawlins. As he looped his reins around the hitching post, his eyes fell on a sturdy buckskin horse tied up across the street, in front of the general store. It was a common enough horse, but there was something familiar about the brand on its flank, about the worn tooling on the saddle. A slow, cold smile spread across Caleb's face. He knew that horse. He would know it anywhere. "Well, I'll be," he murmured to himself, his smile turning into a predatory grin. "Look what the wind blew in. My big brother, Jesse." He straightened his gun belt and sauntered into the saloon, the pieces of a very profitable puzzle clicking into place in his mind. The information hit Jesse like a physical blow. He was in a saloon 50 miles east of Purgatory Flat, a place where men with loose tongues and heavy coin purses came to drink. He'd been listening, nursing a single whiskey, when he overheard 2 surveyors talking about the Blackwood mining claim. They spoke of a snag, a holdout on a prime piece of land, and then they mentioned the enforcers Blackwood had hired to clear it, a gang of ruthless guns for hire, known for getting the job done with fire and fear. The surveyors laughed about the gang's leader, a man with ice in his veins and a ghost for a brother, a man named Caleb Rawlins. Jesse left his whiskey untouched on the bar. The ride back to Clara's homestead was a blur of cold fury and rising panic. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't feel it. He felt only the icy dread of the past rising up to consume the fragile present he had just begun to build. He had let his brother go once, And now Caleb was coming, a specter of Jesse's own failure, to destroy the one person who was beginning to heal him. He rode the last mile hard, Dust sensing the urgency, and burst from the tree line into the clearing. Clara was outside, splitting firewood with a determined, if awkward, swing of the axe. She looked up, startled by his frantic approach, a question in her good eye. "Pack what you can carry," he said, his voice ragged as he swung down from the saddle. "We have to leave, now!" She lowered the axe, her face hardening. "Leave? What are you talking about?" "The mining company. I know who they hired to run you off this land." He took a step closer, his hands clenched. "It's a gang of hired guns, and the man leading them, the man they sent to get rid of you, is my brother." The words hung in the cold, thin air between them. Clara stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock and a dawning, terrible understanding. She looked from his desperate face to the cabin, the home he had helped her rebuild, the only place in the world she had left. "You have to go," Jesse urged, his voice cracking with the strain. "We can head north, into the mountains. You can find a place where they'll never look for you." Clara was silent for a long moment. She looked at the graves of her family, then at the solid new roof on her cabin, at the chimney he had so carefully mended. She had spent a year hiding from the world, a ghost in the ruins of her own life. This man, this quiet, haunted man, had given her back a piece of that life. He had helped her rebuild her home, and in doing so, had helped her begin to rebuild herself. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the mountains themselves. "Clara, you don't understand," Jesse pleaded. "You don't know what these men are capable of, what he is capable of." "And you don't understand me," she countered, her chin lifting. "This is my home. My family is buried here. Ambrose and his friends burned it to the ground once and left me for dead. I survived. I hid. I was afraid." She took a step toward him, her good eye blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "I am not afraid anymore. I'm not running anymore." Her defiance was magnificent and terrifying. He saw the woman she had been before the fire, the woman of strength and conviction, re-emerge from the shell of the victim, but it was a strength that could get her killed. She saw the conflict in his face, the fear he felt for her. Her expression softened. "Stay, Jesse," she said, her voice dropping, becoming almost a plea. "Stay the winter. With me." The request was a punch to the gut. It was everything he wanted and everything he feared. To stay was no longer about dropping off supplies or mending a roof. To stay was to choose a side, to plant his feet and face down his own blood. It was to admit that this was more than a debt of conscience. He looked away, toward the gray, heavy sky. "Clara, if I stay, I don't just protect you." He finally turned back to her, his own soul raw and exposed in his eyes. "I fall." She held his gaze, unflinching. She understood. He was not just falling for her. He was falling away from the lonely, wandering path he had set for himself, falling into a life he thought he had lost the right to live. "Then fall," she whispered. That night, the snow began. It came down not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, driving curtain of white, a blizzard that descended from the mountains and swallowed the prairie whole. The world shrank to the four walls of the small cabin. They were trapped, sealed off from the rest of the world by a wall of swirling snow. The days that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm of survival and discovery. The looming threat of Caleb and his men seemed a distant thing, held at bay by the storm. Inside the cabin, a new kind of life took root. The silence between them was now filled with small domestic sounds, the scrape of a knife against a whetstone, the soft bubble of stew on the stove, the crackle of the fire. Jesse taught her how to properly clean and oil his revolver, his large hands guiding hers until the tremor left them. He showed her how to mend a broken strap on his saddlebags, the simple, practical work calming her nerves. In return, she brought a quiet order to the small space, her touch making the rough-hewn cabin feel more like a home than it had in years. And she began to laugh more, real, genuine laughs that started in her chest and lit up her good eye. She laughed when he told a dry story about a stubborn mule he once owned. She laughed at herself when she nearly tripped over his boots. Each laugh was a victory, a small reclamation of the joy that had been stolen from her. The forced intimacy of the cabin stripped away the last of their defenses. They were no longer just a man and a woman defined by their scars. They were Jesse and Clara. One evening, they sat by the fire, the wind shrieking outside like a hungry beast. Clara was mending one of his shirts, her head bent in concentration, the firelight warming the unblemished side of her face. She held the needle awkwardly in her scarred right hand, her gloved left hand lying still and useless in her lap. Jesse watched her, a deep ache in his chest. He saw her frustration as she fumbled with the thread. He saw the constant, quiet battle she fought every single day. "Let me see," he said softly. She froze, her head still bent. "See what?" "Your hand," he said. She went rigid. The gloved hand was her last shield, the one part of her ruin she kept completely hidden from the world. She had never taken it off in his presence. She slowly raised her head, her eye wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. He saw the question there. "Can you look at this too? Can you see all of my ugliness and not turn away?" He didn't say anything. He just held out his own hand, palm up, an offering. It was the bravest thing he had ever seen her do. After a long, agonizing moment, she placed her gloved hand in his. Her fingers were stiff beneath the worn leather. Slowly, with infinite care, Jesse worked the glove free, pulling it down over her fingers one by one. The hand that emerged was a landscape of pain. The fire had fused the skin, twisting her fingers into a tight, permanent claw. The flesh was a pale, mottled tapestry of scar tissue, delicate and brittle. It was a hand that could no longer hold a paintbrush, a hand that could not properly return a touch. It was the hand that had pulled her brother from the flames. He held it in both of his, its strange, ruined texture against his calloused palms. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He saw it not as a thing of horror, but as a testament to her love, her sacrifice. He lifted her hand to his lips and, one by one, he gently kissed each twisted finger. He kissed the scarred knuckles. He kissed the ruined palm. Each kiss was a prayer, a promise that he saw her, all of her, and found her beautiful. Tears streamed silently from Clara's eye, dripping onto their joined hands. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound and overwhelming release. When he finally lowered her hand, still holding it tight, he looked up and saw that the last wall between them had crumbled into dust. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not passionate. It was not born of hunger or lust. It was slow, unsure, a question asked in the dark. It tasted of salt from her tears and wood smoke from the fire. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of quiet understanding. It was the most honest kiss he had ever known. For a moment, she responded, a soft, yielding pressure. Then, with a small gasp, she broke it off, turning her head away, her breath coming in ragged hitches. "You shouldn't," she whispered, her voice choked. "You shouldn't want me." Jesse reached up and gently cupped her jaw. Turning her face back to his, he made her look at him, made her see the absolute certainty in his eyes. "I don't want what's perfect, Clara," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I want what's real, and I want what's left, if that's still you." Her breath caught in her throat. He was not trying to fix her. He was not pitying her. He was choosing her, wreckage and all. She leaned into his touch, and this time, when he kissed her, she kissed him back. The blizzard broke 2 days later, leaving the world pristine and silent under a thick blanket of snow. But the peace was short-lived. The next morning, Jesse saw them. Tracks, A single rider, on the ridge overlooking the cabin. The man had been careful, but not careful enough. He had been watching them. The tension returned to the cabin, sharp and immediate. The outside world had found them again. That afternoon, Clara proved she was no longer a victim, while Jesse was checking his rifle. She walked out toward the narrow, game trail that led down from the ridge. He watched from the window as she worked, her movements deliberate. She dug a shallow pit and covered it with a lattice of weak branches, then disguised it with a layer of snow and pine needles. It was a simple trap, but in the dark, for a man in a hurry, it could easily break a horse's leg. She came back inside, her face grim but resolute. She remembered how to fight. That night, the nearness of the threat, the unspoken fear of the coming dawn, changed the air between them. They sat by the fire, not speaking, the space charged with everything they had not yet said, everything they had not yet done. It was not lust that drove them, but a desperate, human need to feel alive in the face of death, a need to affirm the life they had found in each other before it could be taken away. He reached for her, and she came to him without hesitation. Their love-making was like their first kiss, slow, tender, a discovery. It was an act of solace, of finding a sanctuary in each other's arms. He touched her scars, the ruined side of her face, not as something to be ignored, but as a part of her he was claiming as his own. And in his arms, under his gentle touch, she did not feel broken. She felt whole. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets on his bedroll, the fire casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Clara was nestled against his chest, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. She was quiet for a long time, and he thought she had fallen asleep. Then she spoke, her voice a soft murmur against his skin. "No one's touched me like I wasn't broken." He held her tighter, his heart aching with a fierce, protective love. He held her all night, a silent guardian, while the moon cast long, dark shadows across the snow outside. From the top of the ridge, hidden in a thicket of pine trees, a man lowered his field glasses. Caleb Rawlins watched the single, warm light of the cabin window, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He had seen enough. His brother, the righteous lawman, had gone soft. He had found himself a broken-down woman in a broken-down cabin. This was going to be even easier, and more satisfying than he had imagined. The attack came with the dawn. The first light was a pale, gray wash over the snow when the sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning's peace. The bullet splintered the window frame, showering the floor with wood and glass. Jesse was already moving, rolling off his bedroll and grabbing his rifle in one fluid motion, his mind instantly clear and cold. "Stay down!" he yelled to Clara, who was crouched by the hearth, her face pale, but her eyes wide and alert, not with panic, but with a grim focus. Another shot tore through the log wall near her head. She didn't flinch. She crawled on her belly toward the small chest where she kept the revolver he had taught her to use. "They're in the trees," Jesse said, his voice low and steady as he peered through a chink in the wall. "4 of them, maybe 5. They'll try to draw us out or set fire to the cabin." He fired a single, careful shot toward a muzzle flash, and was answered by a curse from the woods. He looked back at Clara. She had the revolver now, its dark metal a stark contrast to her pale, trembling hands. He saw the fear in her, but he also saw the iron resolve beneath it. "Clara, listen to me," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "The back window. It has the best view of the shed and the woodpile. I need you to watch that side. Don't fire unless you have to. Don't fire unless they try to burn us out. Do you understand?" She gave a single, sharp nod, her jaw set. She crawled to the rear of the cabin, positioning herself below the small window, the revolver held tight in a two-handed grip. The next hour was a tense siege. Gunshots echoed in the cold air, punctuated by long, unnerving silences. Jesse was a master of this deadly game. moving from one side of the cabin to the other, making his single rifle sound like three. He was economical with his shots, never wasting a bullet, his movements precise and deadly. He was no longer the quiet, haunted man who mended roofs. He was the lawman he used to be, a formidable force of will and skill. Then, through the cacophony, he heard a new sound, the scrape of a boot on the side of the shed. He risked a glance out the main window and saw one of the hired guns, a lanky man with a cruel face, dashing from the cover of the trees. In his hand, he carried a lit torch. "Clara, the shed!" Jesse yelled. "He's at the shed!" He saw the man reach the small outbuilding, his arm pulling back to toss the torch onto the dry roof. Jesse raised his rifle, but his angle was bad. The corner of the cabin blocked his shot. From the back of the cabin, the revolver exploded. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Jesse saw the man at the shed jerk backward as if punched, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. The torch fell from his hand, sputtering out in the snow. The man crumpled to the ground and lay still. Clara had not hesitated. A fresh volley of bullets peppered the cabin walls, the attackers enraged by the loss of their man. Jesse fired back, driving them to cover. He glanced at Clara. She was still in position, her face ashen, a thin line of smoke curling from the barrel of the revolver. But her hands were steady now. The woman who flinched at the sound of a hammer had just taken a man's life to defend her home. The attackers changed their tactics. They began a concerted rush, firing wildly as they charged from the trees. Jesse moved to the front door, the cabin's most vulnerable point. He took down one man as he broke from the tree line, a clean shot to the shoulder that sent him spinning into the snow. Another took his place, then another. It was in this chaotic exchange that Jesse felt it, a white-hot, searing pain in his left thigh. His leg buckled beneath him, and he went down with a grunt, his rifle clattering to the floor. He looked down and saw the dark, wet patch spreading rapidly across his trousers. "Jesse!" Clara's cry was sharp with terror. He gritted his teeth against the wave of pain and nausea, pushing himself up against the wall. "I'm all right," he lied, his voice strained. "Stay where you are." But it was too late. The lull in his firing had given them the opening they needed. The cabin door burst inward with a splintering crash, and a man stood silhouetted against the bright morning snow. Behind him stood another. It was Caleb. Jesse raised his Colt, his hands shaking from the blood loss, but a brutal kick sent it flying from his grip. Caleb stepped into the cabin, his gun leveled at Jesse's chest, a cold, triumphant smirk on his face. "Well, brother," Caleb said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Looks like you finally found something worth bleeding for." He gestured with his gun, and the other man dragged Clara out from the back of the cabin. She fought, kicking and scratching like a wildcat, but the man was too strong. He twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her to her knees. Caleb walked over and looked down at her, his smirk turning into a contemptuous sneer. He reached down and roughly pushed a stray strand of hair away from the scarred side of her face. "So, this is it," he said, his voice a low drawl. "This is the broken little bird my big brother decided to save. He always did have a soft spot for lost causes." Clara spat at his feet. Caleb's eyes flashed with anger. He backhanded her, the force of the blow snapping her head to the side. A guttural roar of pure rage erupted from Jesse's chest. He tried to lunge forward, but his wounded leg collapsed under him, and he fell back against the wall, helpless. The room was beginning to spin, dark spots dancing in front of his eyes. "Don't touch her!" Jesse snarled, his voice a weak rasp. Caleb laughed. "You're not in a position to be giving orders. Jesse," he turned to his man, "tie her up. We're taking her to town. Sheriff Brody is expecting a squatter who resisted a lawful eviction with deadly force." As they dragged a struggling Clara toward the door, Jesse's vision blurred. The last thing he saw was her face, her one good eye locked on his. filled not with fear for herself, but with terror for him. He tried to say her name, but the world dissolved into blackness. Through the fog, he heard himself murmur the words that had haunted him for years, now given a new, desperate meaning. "Don't let me lose you too." When he awoke, the cabin was cold and silent. The first thing he felt was a throbbing, agonizing pain in his leg. He looked down. Someone had crudely bandaged the wound with a torn piece of a bedsheet, but it was soaked through with blood. Clara, she must have done it before they took her. He was weak, dizzy, but a single, galvanizing thought cut through the pain. They had her. It took him 2 days to get to Purgatory Flat. He half walked, half crawled the first few miles, using his rifle as a crutch, his leg on fire with every step. He found his horse, Dust, wandering nearby, and managed to haul his battered body into the saddle. The ride was a long, delirious nightmare of pain and fevered determination. He arrived in town looking like a ghost. His face was pale and drawn. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, and he leaned heavily on his rifle as he limped down the main street toward the sheriff's office. People stopped and stared, their mouths agape at the sight of him. He kicked open the door to the jailhouse. Sheriff Brody was sitting at his desk, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up, and his face went slack with shock. "Rollins," he stammered. "What in God's name happened to you? Where is she?" Jesse's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Now, calm down," Brody said, standing up and placing a hand on the butt of his pistol. "That woman of yours is right where she belongs, locked up. She's facing charges of squatting, theft of mineral rights, and murder. She killed one of Blackwood's men." "She defended her home," Jesse spat, taking a limping step forward. "From your hired thugs. You're a disgrace to that badge. Brody, the mining company owns you." Brody's face flushed with anger and guilt. "Get out of my office, Rollins. You have no authority here." "I'm not leaving without her," Jesse said. He was swaying on his feet, but his eyes burned with an unholy fire. From the street, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Caleb stepped out from the saloon across the way, a smug look on his face. "Having some trouble, Sheriff?" he called out. The sight of his brother sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through Jesse. He turned and limped out onto the boardwalk to face him, the whole town watching. "This is between you and me, Caleb," Jesse said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. Caleb laughed. "It was never about you, Jesse. It was just a job. The woman was trespassing, and you were aiding and abetting. It's all nice and legal." From the small, barred window of the jail, Clara's face appeared. "Jesse, no!" she cried out, her voice filled with anguish. "Your leg!" The townsfolk began to murmur. They saw Jesse, wounded and bleeding, but standing tall in defense of a woman they had scorned. They saw Caleb, swaggering and cruel, the face of the powerful mining company that was slowly strangling their own livelihoods. They saw Sheriff Brody, looking nervous and shifty. The simple narrative they had been fed of a crazy, violent ghost woman was beginning to unravel. A fight broke out. It wasn't a clean draw. It was a desperate, ugly brawl. One of Caleb's men tried to grab Jesse from behind, and Jesse spun, his rifle butt catching the man square in the jaw. Caleb lunged, and the two brothers crashed off the boardwalk into the muddy street, their lifelong conflict finally erupting into open violence. It was a brutal, grinding fight. Jesse was weakened by his wound, but he fought with the fury of a cornered animal. They rolled in the cold mud, trading savage blows. Caleb was younger, faster, but Jesse was driven by a righteous fury that his brother could not match. He was fighting for more than his own life. He was fighting for Clara's. He was fighting for the small piece of his soul he had found again in her quiet company. The town watched, mesmerized. They saw not just a fight, but a story. The story of a man's devotion, his raw, untamed defense of a woman they had all wronged with their whispers and their judgment. Suddenly, a woman's voice cut through the air. That's enough!" The crowd parted. A small, gray-haired woman in a simple black dress stepped forward. It was Sarah Gable, a widow who lived on the edge of town. Her face was stern, her eyes clear. "Sheriff Brody," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "You let that girl go. She's no squatter." Brody looked flustered. "Now, Sarah, this is official business." "And this is the truth," the widow interrupted. She held up a small, worn Bible. "I swear on this book. Last winter, my boy took ill. I had no money for medicine. No food. I was ready to give up. Then Clara Miller came to my door. She brought me food, flour and pork, and a jar of salve for my son's fever. She shared what little she had, and she showed me the deed to her land, the one her father filed and paid for. She owns that homestead, free and clear. The only thieves here are the ones from the mining company, and the law that's helping them." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. They looked at the widow, a woman known for her honesty. They looked at the bleeding man in the mud, and they looked at the jailhouse window, where the ghost woman they had mocked now seemed like something else entirely. A victim, a neighbor. The tide of public opinion, a slow and powerful thing, began to turn. In the street, Jesse had gained the upper hand. He had Caleb pinned in the mud, his hands around his brother's throat, his face a mask of rage. He could end it. He could squeeze the life out of this man who had betrayed him, who had hurt Clara, who had cost him everything. He saw the flash of fear in Caleb's eyes, the same fear he had seen in the rail car all those years ago. And in that moment, something inside Jesse broke. But it was not his spirit. It was the chains of his own guilt. He was not that man anymore. He was not defined by that single past failure. He let go. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying, covered in mud and blood. Caleb lay gasping in the street. Jesse looked down at his brother, not with hatred, but with a deep, profound sadness and a newfound clarity. He had a choice, not between the law and his brother, but between vengeance and what was right. "I lost my brother once," Jesse said, his voice clear and strong, for all the town to hear. "I'm not losing what's right again." He turned his back on Caleb and limped toward the jailhouse, leaving his brother and his past to drown in the mud. The town of Purgatory Flat held its breath. Jesse Rollins stood before the jailhouse, caked in mud, blood, and righteous conviction, having turned his back on the brother he had finally, truly, lost. The crowd, silent and shamed, parted for him as he limped to the door. Behind him, Caleb scrambled to his feet and, without a word, mounted his horse and rode away, his posse of hired guns melting back into the shadows from which they came. His defeat was total, not by a bullet, but by a moral stand he could never comprehend. Sheriff Brody, his face the color of old parchment, fumbled with the ring of keys at his belt. His authority had evaporated in the muddy street. He was no longer the law. He was just a man who had been caught on the wrong side of the truth. He unlocked the cell door and swung it open, avoiding Jesse's gaze. Clara stood in the shadows of the cell. She looked at Jesse, her one good eye taking in his wounded leg, his battered face, and the fierce, unwavering love that burned there for her. She stepped out into the light, and he reached for her, his hand finding hers. It was not a passionate embrace. It was the quiet, desperate click of two tumblers falling into place, of two souls finding their lock and key. The mining company's retreat was as swift as it was silent, faced with a town that had found its conscience, led by a widow's unshakable testimony. Their legal claims crumbled. Their representatives were gone by morning, leaving behind only unpaid bills at the saloon and the bitter taste of their greed. 2 days later, Sheriff Brody pinned a handwritten note to his office door announcing his resignation and rode out of town before the sun was fully up. Clara's walk out of that jail was a resurrection. She did not scurry away, hiding from the stares of the townsfolk. She walked with her head held high, Jesse limping steadily beside her, his hand never leaving hers. She had taken the pins from her hair, and it fell loose around her shoulders, the color of prairie wheat in the sun. She did not hide the scarred side of her face. She wore her survival openly, a testament to the fire she had walked through and the woman she had become. The people of Purgatory Flat watched her go, and for the first time, they saw not a ghost, but a woman of flesh and blood, of grit and grace. Sarah Gable, the widow, met her on the boardwalk and pressed a small sack of fresh bread into her hand, a silent apology from the entire town. They spent the night in the back room of the general store, Silas insisting, his earlier callousness replaced by a deep, remorseful respect. Jesse's leg was cleaned and properly stitched by the town's doctor, who confirmed no bones were broken, though the healing would be long and slow. The next morning, as the sun rose, casting a clean, hopeful light over the plains, Jesse looked at Clara. "I can take you away from here," he said, his voice soft. "We can go north or west to the coast. Find somewhere new, somewhere the memories aren't so loud." It was an offer of escape, of a clean slate, an offer to leave the ghosts of Purgatory Flat and the burned-out cabin behind them forever. Clara looked out the window at the endless expanse of the land that had taken everything from her, the land that was soaked with the blood and tears of her past. She had every reason to hate it, to run from it. But she turned back to him, and in her eye, he saw not a desire for escape, but a deep, quiet resolve to reclaim what was hers. "No," she said gently. "I've spent long enough running from this place. This is my home. It's where my family rests." She took his hand, her grip firm. "I want to rebuild what I lost, if you'll stay." The question was not a plea, but an invitation, an offer of partnership. She was not asking him to save her. She was asking him to build with her. Jesse looked at this woman, at her strength, at the unwavering light in her eye, and he knew he had been the one who had been wandering, lost. He had been the one in need of a home. "I'll stay," he said, and in those two words, a new world was born. The work of rebuilding began with the turning of the seasons. The last of the winter snows melted, and the prairie began to breathe again. The first green shoots of new grass pushing through the cold earth. Their life was measured not in days or weeks, but in tasks completed. They worked side by side, a team forged in fire and faith. They tore down what was left of the burned section of the cabin, salvaging what timber they could. Jesse, leaning on a rough-hewn crutch, his leg a constant, throbbing ache, taught Clara the rudiments of carpentry. He showed her how to measure and saw a straight line, how to drive a nail home with a clean, efficient stroke. She was a quick study, her artist's eye lending itself to the new craft. Her scarred left hand was a hindrance, but she learned to compensate, her right hand becoming strong and sure. Their love was not a thing of grand pronouncements or passionate displays. It was a quiet, sturdy structure they were building, just like the cabin. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of water without her asking, knowing she was tired. It was in the way she would rebandage his leg every evening, her touch gentle and sure. It was in the long, comfortable silences as they worked, the unspoken understanding that flowed between them as easily as the prairie wind. Jesse's limp lessened with the passing months. Through the spring and into the warmth of early summer, his strength returned. The crutch was set aside, and though a slight stiffness in his leg would likely remain with him forever, he was whole again. He had been healed not just by time, but by purpose. He was no longer a man drifting from his past. He was a man building a future. One warm afternoon, he came back from checking the new fence line to find Clara not in the garden, but sitting under the shade of the lone cottonwood tree. She had her old sketch pad in her lap, a stick of charcoal in her hand. For months, she had not drawn. The trauma of the past had silenced the artist inside her. But now, she was drawing again. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her. He looked over her shoulder and saw what she was creating. It was not a picture of fire or of shadows, or of a man riding away into a storm. She had drawn the prairie, vast and alive with detail, every blade of grass rendered with a loving precision. In the foreground sat Jessie's worn hat, resting on a fence post, and just below it, the focus of the entire piece, were two hands, intertwined. One was large and calloused, a man's hand, strong and protective. The other was smaller, a woman's hand, the fingers twisted and scarred, yet held with such tenderness that the scars themselves seemed to lose their power. It was a picture not of what was broken, but of what was whole. It was a picture of them. Their new life settled into a gentle, stable rhythm. They were no longer two damaged people surviving. They were a man and a woman, living. They had found in the ruins of their pasts the foundation for a quiet and profound happiness. The cabin was rebuilt, stronger than before. A new porch stretched across the front, its wood still smelling of fresh-cut pine. A garden, twice as large as the old one, flourished under Clara's patient care. The ghosts of the past had not vanished entirely, but their voices had grown quiet, replaced by the sounds of a home, the rhythmic thump of an axe splitting wood, the soft murmur of conversation, the sound of laughter carrying on the evening breeze. One night, as summer was beginning to soften into the golden light of autumn, they sat together on the new porch swing Jessie had built. A blanket was wrapped around their shoulders, and the sky was a brilliant tapestry of stars. The world was quiet, peaceful. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, her scarred cheek resting against the rough fabric of his shirt. She was silent for a long time, and he could feel the weight of a thought she was turning over in her mind. Finally, she spoke, her voice a near whisper, a confession of her deepest, most hidden fear. "I thought no one would ever want me again." The words were a ghost from a life that seemed a world away, a life of isolation and shame, of believing her scars had made her unlovable, a broken thing to be discarded. Jessie did not answer right away. He simply tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer, as if to physically shield her from the memory of that pain. He looked out at the vast, dark prairie, a land that did not care for perfection, a land that was beautiful in its rugged, scarred, and untamed reality. He had not come here seeking a perfect life, or a woman without wounds. He had come here seeking a reason to stop running, and he had found it in her. He looked down at the top of her head, at the moonlight shining in her hair, and answered her with the simplest, most profound truth he had ever known. "I didn't want what was perfect," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear. "I wanted you." She tilted her head up to look at him, and in the starlight, he could see the tears shining in her good eye, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a deep, abiding peace. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss of quiet certainty, of promises kept, of a love that had been born not in spite of their scars, but because of them. And as they sat there on the porch, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of their shared world, the last vestiges of winter in their souls finally melted away, making way for a long and hopeful spring. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.